All right, before we talk about connecting our React apps to a backend, you need to understand how to use the effect hook in React. Earlier, I told you that our React components should be pure functions. A pure function should not have any side effects and should return the same result if we give it the same input. Now, to make our functions or components pure, we have to keep any code that makes changes outside of the render phase. But there are situations where we might need to store some data in the local storage of the browser so we can remember it in the future. Or we might need to call the server to fetch or save the data, or we may want to manually modify DOM elements. Now, none of these situations are about rendering a component. They have nothing to do with returning some JSX markup. So where can we implement them? That's where the effect hook comes in. With the effect hook, we can tell React to execute a piece of code after a component is rendered. So here's an example. Here in the app component, let's add an input with a class of form-control. Now let's say when the app starts, we want to put focus on this input field. To do this, first we need to use the ref hook to get a reference to this input field. So we call useRef and initialize it with null. Now the type of the target element is HTML input element. So we call this and get a reference object. Then we associate the reference object with our input field. Now we check if ref.current is defined. Then we call ref.current.focus. Now here's the thing. This piece of code has nothing to do with returning some JSX markup. With this piece of code, we are changing the state of the DOM. So we say this piece of code has a side effect. It's changing something outside of this component. So now our component is no longer a pure component. To make this a pure component, we can use the effect hook. So here we type use effect, press enter. So it's imported on the top. Then we call this hook or this function and give it an arrow function. Next, we move this piece of code that causes side effect inside this function. Okay? This is the effect hook. Now the name is a little bit confusing. A lot of people hate it. It would be better if it was called after render. So the function that we pass here will be called after each render. And this is an opportunity for us to write any piece of code that causes side effect. We can store something in the local storage. We can work with the DOM elements. We can call the server and so on. Now, there are a few things you need to know about the effect hook. Just like the state and ref hooks, we can only call the effect hook at the top level of our components. So we cannot call it inside loops or if statements. And also, similar to the ref and state hooks, we can call this multiple times for different purposes. For example, right after, we can have another effect. So use effect. Now in this function, perhaps we want to set the title of the document to my app. So here we have two different types of effects. One is about putting focus on a DOM element. The other is about setting the title of the document. These are two separate responsibilities. Now back to the browser. Look, our input got focus and the title of the document changed to my app. So this is the idea behind the effect hook. So when we have multiple effects, React will run them in order after each render.